June 6, 1944. Before the sun fully rose, the Channel was already awake. A grey horizon stretched endlessly, silent and cold. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the mist. Hundreds, then thousands. An entire fleet moving as one. Warships, destroyers, landing craft, more vessels than the sea had ever carried into battle at a single time. Their engines rumbled like distant thunder beneath the water. This was not just another assault, it was the beginning of the end for Nazi-occupied Europe. Naval guns ignited first, massive shells arced across the sky, trailing smoke behind them. Seconds later, the coastline of Normandy erupted. Sand, concrete and fire burst upward as if the earth itself had cracked open. But inside the landing craft, none of that mattered. There were no grand speeches, only young men gripping rifles too tightly. Water pooled around their boots. The metal walls vibrated with each distant impact. Faces were pale. Eyes were fixed on the front ramp. No one needed instructions. They knew. When that door dropped, hesitation would mean death. The ramp slammed down. Instantly, machine gun fire tore into the front ranks. German defenses had survived the bombardment. From fortified bunkers high above the shore, MG-42S unleashed streams of bullets so fast they sounded like ripping fabric. Men fell before touching the sand. Others stumbled forward into chest-deep water, weighed down by gear. Some disappeared beneath the surface, never to rise again. Omaha Beach was not a landing zone. It was a killing field. Steel obstacles waited beneath the tide. Mortars exploded among clustered troops. Smoke drifted across the chaos, mixing with screams and shouted commands barely audible over gunfire. Still, movement continued. Survival meant reaching the shingle bank, crawling, dragging the wounded, using fallen equipment as cover. Combat engineers began clearing paths under direct fire. Explosive tubes were pushed beneath barbed wire. Charges detonated, ripping narrow openings through the defensive maze. Each explosion created seconds of opportunity, and seconds were everything. Small groups gathered at the base of the bluffs. There was no dramatic charge, only exhausted men climbing muddy slopes with trembling hands. Above them, concrete bunkers still spat fire. But slowly, against expectation, Americans reached the top. Grenades rolled into gun positions. Close combat replaced long-range slaughter. Smoke filled tight corridors carved into stone. One bunker fell, then another. By late morning, the impossible had happened. The beachhead, fragile, bloody, incomplete, existed. The invasion had survived its first test. But inland, something even more dangerous waited. Beyond the shoreline, Normandy did not open into wide, welcoming fields. Instead, it closed in. The countryside was divided by thick earthen walls covered in tangled hedges, some taller than a man. These ancient boundaries, peaceful for centuries, had become ready-made fortifications. This was the bocage, and it changed everything. Visibility dropped to a few yards. Tanks could not maneuver easily. Every bend in a dirt lane concealed uncertainty. A rifle cracked from behind a hedge. A soldier dropped. No warning, no clear target. The enemy was invisible. Artillery pounded suspected positions, tearing apart trees and spraying soil across narrow roads. Sherman tanks forced their way through embankments, engines straining as roots snapped beneath steel tracks. But German forces adapted quickly. Anti-tank guns waited behind concealed openings. Mines were buried along likely routes of advance. One careless step could end a life instantly. Fighting here was intimate. Room-to-room clearing in shattered farmhouses. Shadows moving behind broken staircases. Grenades bouncing once, twice, before detonating in enclosed spaces. Dust turned sunlight into pale beams cutting through darkness. Church bells no longer rang. Village squares stood empty, except for rubble and burned carts frozen mid-motion. Wells overflowed. Doors hung from twisted hinges. War had swallowed ordinary life whole. Air support returned repeatedly. Fighter bombers screamed low over fields, dropping payloads that shook entire valleys. Hedge lines vanished in bursts of flame and dirt, yet every destroyed barrier revealed another one behind it. Progress measured not in miles, but in meters. Then came armored resistance. A German Panther rolled into view down a narrow lane, its barrel scanning methodically. One precise shot disabled a Sherman instantly. American crews fired back. Explosions echoed through confined spaces, amplified by the walls of earth on either side. When tanks burned inside the bocage, smoke had nowhere to go. It clung to the ground, black and suffocating. Still, Allied units pressed forward because behind them lay the sea, and retreat was no longer an option. By late afternoon, the battle no longer resembled an organized front. It was fragments of violence scattered across fields and villages. German artillery launched coordinated barrages from deeper inland. Shells fell in rolling sequences, walking across terrain with terrifying precision. Crater after crater opened in farmland that had once grown wheat. Allied forces regrouped. Heavier tanks, including Churchill units, reinforced weakened lines. Infantry advanced close behind armored hulls, using them as mobile cover against machine gun nests hidden in barns and stone walls. A final defensive belt formed around key crossroads. German crews fought stubbornly, firing until positions were physically destroyed. There were no dramatic retreats, only gradual collapse under overwhelming pressure. Aircraft returned once more, targeting strongpoints identified by forward observers. Bombs struck with surgical brutality. The hedgerows that had protected defenders all day were now burning. As evening approached, something shifted. The intensity did not vanish, but it loosened. Gunfire became scattered rather than constant. Smoke thinned. For the first time since dawn, Allied soldiers could look across open ground without immediately diving for cover. Behind them stretched miles of coastline littered with wreckage, proof of the price paid that morning. Ahead lay the interior of France, the road network that would eventually lead to Paris. D-Day was not victory, it was access. A foothold carved into occupied Europe by force. Thousands had fallen in less than a single day, but the Atlantic Wall had been breached. On June 6, 1944, the balance of the war shifted permanently. The sea had delivered more than soldiers. It had delivered inevitability, and from that grey morning forward, the countdown to liberation had begun. Night did not bring silence to Normandy. Instead, darkness amplified everything. Distant artillery flashes pulsed along the horizon. Engines rumbled through narrow lanes. Medics moved between the wounded, their silhouettes barely visible under dim red lights. The beachhead was secure, but fragile. Supplies had to come ashore, ammunition, fuel, reinforcements. The sea that had delivered invasion now became a lifeline. German forces understood this. Counterattacks struck at weak points, probing the Allied lines. Small units slipped through hedgerows at night, testing defenses with sudden bursts of fire. No one truly slept. By mid-June, the objective shifted. Breakout. The hedgerow country had slowed the advance to a crawl. Casualties mounted not in dramatic waves, but in steady, exhausting attrition. Every field had to be cleared, every tree line investigated. Then the focus turned towards Saint-Lô. The town sat at a crossroads of roads and rail lines, a key to moving armor freely across Normandy. German defenders fortified it heavily, turning rubble into strong points. Allied bombers attempted to weaken resistance. Hundreds of aircraft crossed overhead in tight formation. Bombs fell in massive waves, shaking the ground miles away. Entire districts were reduced to shattered stone, but ruins created new hiding places. Infantry fought block by block through what remained of Saint-Lô. Snipers nested inside broken walls, machine guns fired from cellars half buried in debris. The air smelled of dust and cordite. When the town finally fell in July, it was barely recognizable. Yet its capture opened something crucial: space. Commanders prepared for a decisive maneuver, Operation Cobra. Instead of pushing slowly through hedgerows, they would punch through them. At dawn, one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments of the European war began. The ground shook continuously as thousands of tons of explosives tore apart a narrow German sector. Smoke rose in thick pillars visible for miles. Then armored divisions surged forward. Shermans rolled through shattered defensive lines. Infantry followed in disciplined waves. Resistance, stunned and disorganized, began to fracture. For the first time since landing, the battlefield widened. Normandy's tight maze gave way to open countryside. Speed replaced hesitation. The breakout had begun. Once the line cracked, momentum shifted rapidly. German units attempted to regroup near Falaise, hoping to contain the breakthrough. Instead, they found themselves trapped. Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, forming what would later be known as the Falaise Pocket. Artillery thundered without pause. Columns of retreating vehicles clogged narrow roads. Aircraft hunted from above, striking convoys and turning escape routes into burning corridors. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Some German formations fought fiercely to carve a path out. Others collapsed under relentless pressure. When the encirclement tightened, thousands were captured. Equipment was abandoned across fields in chaotic heaps. Tanks without fuel, trucks without drivers. The German position in France had been critically weakened. Now the road to Paris lay open. As Allied columns advanced, French resistance fighters rose in coordinated action. Sabotage operations intensified. Communication lines were cut. Bridges were secured before demolition charges could be triggered. Paris stirred. In August 1944, Allied forces approached the capital. Street fighting erupted as German occupiers made a final stand in key sectors. Barricades appeared across boulevards. Civilians risked their lives to support the uprising. Then, at last, armored vehicles rolled into the city. Crowds flooded the streets despite lingering danger. Flags emerged from hidden drawers. Church bells, silent for years, rang again. Paris was free. The campaign that began on a fog-covered shoreline had transformed the course of the war in Western Europe. But the cost remained written across Normandy's fields, in quiet cemeteries overlooking the sea. D-Day was never just one day. It was the opening chapter of liberation. From the grey waters of the Channel to the streets of Paris, the invasion reshaped history. And it proved something enduring. When enough nations move together with purpose, even the strongest walls can fall. Once the line cracked, momentum shifted rapidly. German units attempted to regroup near Falaise, hoping to contain the breakthrough. Instead, they found themselves trapped. Allied forces closed in from multiple directions, forming what would later be known as the Falaise Pocket. Artillery thundered without pause. Columns of retreating vehicles clogged narrow roads. Aircraft hunted from above, striking convoys and turning escape routes into burning corridors. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Some German formations fought fiercely to carve a path out. Others collapsed under relentless pressure. When the encirclement tightened, thousands were captured. Equipment was abandoned across fields in chaotic heaps. Tanks without fuel, trucks without drivers. The German position in France had been critically weakened. Now, the road to Paris lay open. As Allied columns advanced, French resistance fighters rose in coordinated action. Sabotage operations intensified. Communication lines were cut. Bridges were secured before demolition charges could be triggered. Paris stirred. In August 1944, Allied forces approached the capital. Street fighting erupted as German occupiers made a final stand in key sectors. Barricades appeared across boulevards. Civilians risked their lives to support the uprising. Then at last, armored vehicles rolled into the city. Crowds flooded the streets despite lingering danger. Flags emerged from hidden drawers. Church bells, silent for years, rang again. Paris was free. The campaign that began on a fog-covered shoreline had transformed the course of the war in Western Europe. But the cost remained written across Normandy's fields, in quiet cemeteries overlooking the sea. D-Day was never just one day. It was the opening chapter of liberation. From the grey waters of the Channel to the streets of Paris, the invasion reshaped history. And it proved something enduring. When enough nations move together with purpose, even the strongest walls can fall.